Welcome, everyone, from far and wide. My name is Diana Kopansky, and on behalf of the United Nations Environment Program, I lead the Global Peatlands Initiative. The Global Peatlands Initiative is a partnership of 46 organizations working together to save peatlands as the world's largest terrestrial organic carbon stock. And today I have the pleasure of moderating this side event for our Canadian partners on Canada's peatlands as a nature-based solution to climate change. During the session, we'll be hearing from leading scientists and representatives of Indigenous peoples, the Canadian federal government, private sector, and civil society. Many of you will know that Canada's peatlands hold 1/4 of the world's terrestrial organic carbon stock. Preservation of this carbon is a key nature-based climate solution within Canada and also internationally. As a Canadian myself, these places are really near and dear to my heart, and I'm really so happy to have the Water Institute as one of our Global Peatlands Initiative partners, and we're really grateful that you're here to share your work at the first ever Peatlands Pavilion at the UNFCCC COP26 in Glasgow. It really seems like such a long time that we were there together, online actually. We were adapting on the fly with the challenges that we face with COVID. It was wonderful to really watch that Canadian network grow, strengthen, and reconnect as we hosted a series of virtual workshops together. And it's even more wonderful to say that your network is getting stronger, and that this side event is really going to be a great opportunity for you to share some of that work with everyone else, and also more about the outcomes of the work that you're doing. We're really eager to hear what the state-of-the-art Canadian peatland science is and what the thinking is on the ground there. So we're going to start off the session, everyone, with a series of presentations from speakers sharing their various stakeholder perspectives on Canadian peatlands. And everyone's going to share their stake in peatlands management, key successes, opportunities based on their experience and their deep knowledge. And we'll identify some priority needs to realize the full potential of peatlands as a nature-based solution to climate change, both locally in Canada and also globally. After the presentations, we'll have plenty of time for question and answers and a discussion period with the panel. So please do pop your questions into the Q&A tab online and throughout the event, and take your opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat. So I really have an honor here to introduce our first speaker, Maria Strack. Maria is a professor and Canada Research Chair in Ecosystems and Climate in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on peatland carbon cycling with a focus on response to disturbance and mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through best management practices and ecosystem restoration. Maria, over to you.
Thanks very much, Diana, and it's my great pleasure to be here today as part of this event. I really look forward to hearing the perspectives of all of our speakers and representing the Water Institute and the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change at the University of Waterloo. And as we talk about peatland management in Canada, I think it's firstly so important to acknowledge that Canada is Indigenous land, and that Indigenous people have been stewards of this land for millennia and continue to do so today. We're going to hear from speakers across the country and talk about peatlands across Canada, but I will acknowledge the land that I'm on here in Waterloo, which is the territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee people. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldimand Track, which is land that was promised to the Six Nations and extends 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. I also acknowledge that these words are only one small step in a pathway towards reconciliation, and I look forward to also hearing today about how conservation could play a role in that journey. So as we think about peatland management in the face of climate change, Canada plays such an important role in that because we are so extraordinarily blessed with peatland area and peatland carbon stock. Peatlands cover at least 12% of Canada's land area, over 114 million hectares. And this is a massive carbon stock of about 150 to 160 billion tons of carbon. And as Diana mentioned, represents a quarter of the global peatland carbon stock. So when we think about managing peatlands responsibly and in a climate-friendly way, that management within Canada is not only important nationally, but also globally. And this is not an easy task because peatlands in Canada face many threats. And some of these are in direct response to ongoing climate change, such as enhanced and increasing permafrost thaw in the north, increasing number and severity of wildfires, but also direct anthropogenic disturbances. And we often think of peat extraction, and I know there's been a lot of discussion of peat extraction in the peat pavilion so far, but really it covers much less than 0.1% of Canadian peatlands. And really there's many other disturbances that we also need to understand their impact and how to mitigate it. Not shown here are things like agriculture and hydroelectric reservoirs, but also the expanding resource extraction into the north. And this leads to the development of linear disturbances like roads, pipelines, and pictured here exploration lines created for mapping underlying deposits, the creation of well pads for oil sands extraction, and the development of mines for many different resources. And already Canadian peatlands are facing the impacts of climate change, not only permafrost thaw and changing wildfire regimes, but just the warming that will change the way in which they store and cycle carbon. And this isn't something that we're just looking to in the future. Canadian peatlands are already warming. And this is just a map of temperature changes over about the last 70 years. And you can see, particularly in winter periods, areas where we have dense peat deposits have already warmed in the winter anywhere between 1.5 and 5 degrees Celsius. This likely has really important implications for how they are cycling carbon and will into the future, but particularly in the winter is a time where there's a lot of uncertainty. And Fereidoun Rezanezhad will talk about this in the next talk, how we're advancing understanding in that area. As I mentioned, we also have many direct anthropogenic disturbances along with vast areas of relatively pristine peatland. And these anthropogenic disturbances tend to be most prevalent in the southern boreal forest and into the Western Sedimentary Basin. And we also need to work on understanding these impacts on that carbon stock and how can we reduce those and restore some of these disturbances. So last year, I had the opportunity to work with Nature United and experts on carbon cycling across the country in order to explore the potential for natural climate solutions in Canada. And looking across ecosystems and sectors, we determined that in 2030, there's an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 78 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. This is equivalent to the emissions required or created through the powering of every Canadian home for about 3 years, or a little over 10% of the national current anthropogenic emissions. So this illustrates that nature can play an important role in Canada's ability to meet their climate targets, but it cannot happen alone. From a peatland perspective, we also found that improved wetland management was the second largest opportunity, with avoided peatland conversion accounting for 2/3 of that wetlands total in 2030. So this really highlights, first of all, that Canada has vast areas of relatively pristine peatlands where conservation is really important. It also illustrates the almost immediate benefit you get from conservation because you keep that carbon in the soil and out of the atmosphere. And it also illustrates that policy that incentivizes conservation is going to be really critical in Canada's peatland management strategy. This exercise also made it very clear where some of our uncertainties lie in understanding the potential of peatlands as natural climate solutions in the country. And I've put a few of them here. I'd say the first one is one that we're already tackling and is maybe the least concern. We don't currently have a national wetland map, but many organizations are working towards that. And we think that we can actually have a lot of knowledge by working between those organizations and comparing those maps to understand where uncertainties lie. What was even more difficult, though, was that we don't have a national inventory of disturbance areas, and particularly where those affect peatlands specifically. This highlights a need for collaboration, as this information is housed in different provinces and territories, as well as different industries. We also have scarce data on carbon cycling in peatlands in general, and particularly under disturbance and restoration regimes. We actually have quite a few eddy covariance towers in Canada on peatlands that are measuring ecosystem scale carbon cycling, but it's still very difficult to get annual estimates, particularly given the remote nature of many of our sites, the cold winters, and the vast size of the country just means that in many regions we still lack a lot of data. This is particularly acute under disturbance, where we really just haven't made those measurements of how these disturbances are affecting peatland carbon stocks, and we don't necessarily understand how to restore them or what the impacts on carbon cycling are. And so, as Diana mentioned, both from this exercise and also an invitation from the Global Peatlands Initiative, we planned a workshop of Canadian peatland experts to be hosted in summer of 2020. And as everyone knows, not a lot of meetings went on in the summer of 2020, but we pivoted to a series of online workshops throughout the fall of 2020 that brought together Canadian peatland experts to discuss what a research agenda for peatlands and climate would look like in Canada. Coming out of that, those discussions, those building collaborations, and a funding call from Environment and Climate Change Canada, we've submitted a proposal called Can Peat, which will explore Canadian peatlands as nature-based climate solutions. We're still awaiting the decisions of that call, but we wanted to share a bit about this with you today because we also hope that we can build collaborations with the international community. Our objectives are here, but the main goal is really one of collaboration. We want to bring together Canadian peatland experts and their knowledge so that we can help to reduce these uncertainties and determine peatland management actions that can best reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But we also think it's very important to also develop the policy instruments that will allow those actions to be implemented on the ground. And of course, work with partners and communicate our findings so that we're developing tools and strategies that can actually be implemented. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to Diana.
Thanks so much, Maria. Really interesting work there, and excellent to see that those dialogues of over 150 scientists, including across sectors, actually not just scientists, has come to a really nice possible opportunity for joint research. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Fereidoun Rezanezhad. He's a research associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at University of Waterloo. His research broadly focuses on soil, water, atmosphere interactions and the effects of climate change and management practices on carbon and nutrient biogeochemistry in natural and disturbed ecosystems. His current research area focuses on soil processes in cold, temperate to subarctic and permafrost regions. Over to you, Fereidoun.
Okay, thanks, Diana. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining this Canada Peatlands side event. Yeah, in my presentation today, I will be talking about the Canada's peatland and climate warming with the main focus on winter carbon cycling. As Maria also mentioned, Canada peatlands cover about 25% of the global peatlands cover, and this is about the quarter of the carbon storage in the world. And in Canada, 12% of the Canadian lands are peatland, which contain about the 56% of the organic carbon in all Canadian soils. And from that, about 97% of the Canadian peatlands are in boreal and subarctic, and about 37% are frozen or in the form of permafrost. And the large portion of the permafrost in Canada are peatlands. Canadian peatlands are of particular interest because of their response to anthropogenic disturbance such as the land use change and also the climate warming. As the climate change predictions suggest that the average annual air temperature in northern Canada will increase 3 to 5 degrees by the end of this century. The models also predicts that about 60% of the peatlands and about 56% of the organic carbon mass will be extremely affected by the climate warming. In this talk, I will be mainly focusing on the winter climate warming, as the large complex of the Canadian peatlands are located in northern latitude, and those high latitude regions are warming faster than the global average. And it has been reported that the northern cold regions are warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet, with the greatest warming happening during the winter. As Maria also mentioned, the Canadian peatlands are already warming. As you can see in this graph, that when we look at the projected temperature change, most of the change in temperature are happening during the winter and also the shoulder season of the fall and spring. And you may have seen this graph just recently released that in October 2021, there was about the 4-degree increase of the temperature, warmer than the average temperature from 1951 to 1918. Yeah, both CO2 and methane fluxes studied during the winter demonstrate that the active carbon cycling during like under seasonal snow pack and also the frozen soils. That's showing that with the climate warming, when the soil is warmer, there is more emission is happening that will also accelerate the climate change. This is an important component of the annual respiratory loss for the carbon cycling and also the total carbon budget. And there are still a lot of uncertainties in total peatlands carbon stocks. In this slide, I just want to show you that you can see how the CO2 flux is linked to the soil temperature. As you can see from the graph on the left side, when the soil temperature is increasing, the amount of the CO2 flux is increasing. But for the soil temperature below 0 degree, you can see even with the low as minus 20 degree soil temperature, we are observing some of the winter CO2 fluxes. This is because of the some of the microbial activity and processes happening for the soil below 0 degree. On the graph on the right side, you can see the relative influence of the different parameters, different winter-related parameters to the CO2 flux. As you can see that the soil temperature has is the most influential parameter affecting the CO2 fluxes when we talk about the effect of the parameters on the CO2 flux. In one of our recent study that published this year, we used a machine learning model and also using the data from the 13 years data from the Merbelow peatland in Ottawa, Canada. And then we found that the climate warming can increase the winter carbon loss in Canadian peatlands by more than 100%. This is like a doubling of the amount of the change. Okay, and then this is by end of this century under like a high emission scenario. But when we look at the situation in northern peatland and also the permafrost, our result is showing that we are seeing about the 1700 teragram of the carbon loss during the winter observed across the northern peatland and also the permafrost regions. This is more than the annual uptake of the carbon during the growing season. And then from these two studies, plus the other studies that has been published, is showing that the increase of the winter emissions under climate warming already shifting the northern peatland and permafrost area from an annual carbon sink to a carbon source. The key message here from this presentation is that the winter is a critical period for carbon cycling in Canadian peatland, and it's also important to understand the winter carbon cycling because of the climate warming is having the most impact on the soil temperature during the winter, and also important to taking into account for CO2 emissions. And also considering the winter carbon cycling is important for natural climate solution and for the natural-based climate change mitigation and adaptation. And it's also important to consider the winter carbon cycling for the uncertainty that we have in the emission of the greenhouse gas emission reduction from the peatland management action. This is something that the Canadian scientists are right now working with the partnership with the Indigenous stakeholders and also the government organization. Thank you for your time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Fereidoun. It's really so important and really admirable for those of you that are working in those cold climates. I've got to admit, I do love the warmth of Nairobi, where I've been living for the last 22 years. Really interesting to hear, and I wonder if you're connecting yet up with the scientists from Russia or peoples from Russia that might also be looking at that. So let's think about how we can connect you up. I have the honor now of introducing the next speaker, is Stephen Nitwa. And I met Stephen at the last COP, actually. We were together there. I don't know if you remember me, Stephen, but we were together at a joint climate change event that was hosted, and it was really dynamic event where youth were sharing the impact of change on your communities. Stephen was raised by his great-grandparents on the land around Lutselk'ai and in the Northwest Territories. And in 1999, Stephen was elected to the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly, where he served a 4-year term. In 2008, Stephen became chief of Lutselk'ai Dene First Nations, where he negotiated a formal agreement with the Government of Canada to create the Tai Denanana Protected Area National Park Reserve. And Stephen is currently Senior Advisor to the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, which supports Indigenous nations in honoring their cultural responsibility to care for lands and waters. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. I do remember our time together in Madrid. Seems like a lifetime ago. That was just before COVID hit. So I'm not missing the lineups in Glasgow. That's happening right now. I'm assuming it's a lot more onerous than we experienced in Madrid with all the security requirements and COVID testing requirements. I'm happy to be here to talk about Canada's peatlands and the role of Indigenous peoples and nations across the country. I think it'll be very helpful if one of you guys that has a map of the peatlands of Canada could be put up there to help facilitate my discussion. Today I'm going to be talking about Indigenous nations and governments and peoples and the roles they're taking and assuming in large part in relations with the Canadian governments, federal, provincial, and territorial governments. Several years ago, when Prime Minister Trudeau got elected in 2015, one of the first actions he had entered into was the Vancouver Accord, a domestic accord that speaks to working together to help Canada reach its international commitment under the AG Accord of protecting 17%. As part of that process, what they call Canada's process to Target 1, they created a committee, several committees, and one of the committee was the Indigenous Circle of Experts, which I was a member of. Working with Indigenous experts from across the country, along with provincial, territorial, and federal government appointees, we engaged with Indigenous nations across the country and that pretty much asked the question, what type of relationships would you like to have with the Crown governments for your territories to be used as protected and conserved areas that would qualify towards the targets of 17%. The report that we prepared and with the recommendations speak to a relationship of reconciliation with Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing and doing through their land-based relationship has to be front and center. In the last 3 years, the largest protected areas in the world have been led by Indigenous nations. In my nation, the Fereidoun and Nene National Park Reserve and Territorial Protected and Conserved Areas, which overlays an Indigenous protected and conserved areas that was created by my people, is one of them, and one of the examples of how reconciliation can be achieved within the conservation environment, where roles and responsibilities are clearly articulated through legal contractual agreements, where the nation communities know what their roles and responsibilities are, and they also know the roles and responsibilities of their Crown partners. That speaks a lot and creates a great opportunity for relationship building, where Indigenous worldviews and knowledge systems can influence the science that we use in studying the impacts of climate change and other activities that might impact the peat. Every square inch of this country, every square inch of the areas that have peatlands are Indigenous territories. Indigenous nations right now are proposing 26 major protected areas across the country. One of them, for example, is the Seal River watershed, led by the Rezanezhad in partnership with other Indigenous communities in northeastern Manitoba, where they created the Seal River Watershed Initiative Society to advance this 55,000 square kilometers of protected area. Within that area, there is 1.7 billion metric tons of carbon sink capacity. So you'll see proposals like that advanced by the Seal River Watershed Alliance, led by Indigenous nations across the country in advancing Indigenous protected and conserved areas, whether they stand alone as an Indigenous protected and conserved area or in partnership with the provincial and federal governments using their legislation and legislative tools. The challenge for Indigenous nations is how to participate as equal partners, where their knowledge and their ways of doing and the deep understanding of the relationship with their territories is how to pay for their end of the responsibilities. The problem is that if the federal government or the provincial government is the only one that has the financial resources, then the deep colonial history's ugly head will rear eventually. So the need for creating an environment of equality where resources are provided to those that are being tasked to manage these protected and conserved areas is essential. I'm encouraged by the declaration that's coming out of Glasgow, out of COP26, the millions of dollars that have been identified. It'd be great if Canada's peatlands and Canada's boreal regions and Canada's carbon sink capacity qualifies for some of those resources to be used for the protection, management, and operations of these places, to play a meaningful role in research, monitoring, and planning and implementing plans to mitigate the impacts of climate change in the Northwest Territories and right across the country. I think that's the opportunity to do good for Canada, to do good for the world in the spirit of reconciliation. And there's many relationships that are being built right across the country to support that. And I think Canada can really demonstrate a leadership role that is developing in Canada in relationships between Crown governments and Indigenous governments in the spirit of reconciliation. So in Canada, the confluence of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the agenda of reconciliation are nicely coming together. And it's timely, but it needs resources. Canada is a huge country. It costs a great deal of money to deliver programs and services. We have a small tax base, but we have a huge responsibility. It's interesting to know that 30 to 40% of peatlands and carbon sink capacity is within a 3% of land mass globally. That is Canada. So, it's happening, and there's a great desire by Indigenous nations to take leadership roles in creating, protecting, conserved areas to manage Canada's carbon sink capacity. They just need help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really wonderful. I think that this is really an important example for other communities around the world to look at the experiences of knowing and sharing of the Indigenous people. It's something that we really value and welcome as the Global Peatlands Initiative Partnership as well. I think, we've also through the last week heard so much about peatlands restoration, huge amounts of money, huge amounts of mobilizing individuals to repair the challenges that and the decisions that were made historically. And I think that Canada is in such an incredibly unique position in that, you as Indigenous peoples are safeguarding one of the largest and precious carbon sinks in the world. So I really hope that this process, which you've been part of shaping and framing, still creates and evolves into a really open and powerful partnership. So congratulations and thank you so much for that work. Now I have the privilege of also introducing the next speaker. That's Kara Webster. She's a research scientist in forest soil ecology with the Canadian Forest Service, Natural Resources Canada. She investigates carbon and nutrient cycling in forest and peatland soils to improve policies for forest sustainability in a changing climate, combining field monitoring, empirical and ecosystem modeling, and GIS mapping to investigate soil processes across various spatial scales from plot to landscape. Over to you, Kara.
Thank you, Diana. And I'm coming to you from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and I'd like to acknowledge that this is the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically the Garden River and Botswana First Nations, as well as the Métis people. So my talk is going to be a very brief overview of the work that we have been doing with the Canadian Forest Service to develop a better understanding of peatland emissions and removals of greenhouse gases across Canada's managed forests. And of course, this work represents the work of many dedicated individuals. So the aim is that this work that I'm presenting to you today would feed into the National Forest Carbon Monitoring and Reporting System that separates our forests into managed and unmanaged areas. So annual emissions and removals since 1990 are reported in the managed forests, and only land use change is reported in the unmanaged forests. And so I want to point out that for the purpose of this talk that agricultural and other non-forest areas are not included in this monitoring framework. So within the managed forest, researchers within the Canadian Forest Service produce tools to quantify peatland greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And these tools require that we understand baseline natural carbon sequestration rates, as well as understanding how anthropogenic disturbances and climate change impact these rates. As well, we need to know the extent of these disturbances. And then these tools are then fed into several different assessments and policies. So the recent work that we've been doing within the Canadian Forest Service, specific to the peatland greenhouse gas emissions and removals, dates back to 2014. And this is in part as a response to sort of increased pressure from international reporting on peatlands. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is highlight some of the key outputs from this work to date. And I'm going to touch on various mapping and data synthesis pieces, as well as the development of the Canadian model for peatlands. And while we've had many successes, I just want to highlight that, there's obviously much more that we can do. There's more opportunities and more improvements to further advance this work. So one of the first outputs was developing a national peatland map in a raster format. And the previous Peatlands of Canada map was a polygon-based product, and so it did not provide precise geographic locations. And while there's been some excellent high-resolution mapping done at local to regional scales, such as that done by Ducks Unlimited and other researchers, there was really no consistent national map with peatland categories that were relevant to national reporting. So the map that we produced combined peatland types based on nutrient regime, so split into bog, poor fen, and rich fen, and combine that with vegetation cover, open, treed, and forested. And we recognize that this work isn't perfect. For example, it doesn't include swamps or permafrost, but this is an actively evolving area of research that is continually producing better maps. The next key output was synthesizing published literature values for net ecosystem exchange and methane from field studies across Canada. And so across the major peat-containing ecozones in Canada, we summarize net ecosystem exchange from 66 sites and methane from 157 sites. And for you that do this type of work, you know that this type of field data is really essential to improving not only our understanding of peatland processes, but as well as calibrating and checking our models. And one of the key outcomes of this work was that it highlighted that there are gaps in data from certain ecozones, as well as gaps in understanding, particularly around the role of winter emissions to annual greenhouse gas budgets, since most studies are done during the growing season. And this is something that Fereidoun has talked about just previous in this session. Another key output was data synthesis for other peatland parameters. So this included a peatland productivity and decomposition parameter database and peat profile databases. These databases are sort of ongoing. They're updated as new data is generated or discovered. And these data compilations were absolutely essential for model parameterization and development. So the main output from this work has been the development of the Canadian model for peatlands, or CAMP as we refer to it as. And it's the tool to report on emissions and removals of greenhouse gases from peatlands within the forest ecosystems at the national scale. And so this model works within the existing generic carbon budget model framework used for upland forests. However, I should note that it is currently still under development and is not being used for reporting yet. But it is spatially explicit at the finest resolution available, and it uses an annual time step. And last year, we published on the model, and now we're in the process of analyzing our first national level run, which we hope to be reporting on in the coming months. So our plan is to continue to refine this model. So for example, we want to look at the sub-annual time steps, given the importance of winter emissions. And we also want to include soil temperature and permafrost in future versions of the model. So as you can imagine, incorporating disturbance in the model was a key part of the development. And disturbance dynamics are included by applying a disturbance matrix, which essentially determines the amount of carbon that is transferred from one pool to another or to the atmosphere. And currently only fire disturbance is included in the model. We use the location and area of fires that come from our national fire data sets. And in addition to fire disturbances, we've started work to develop the preliminary disturbance matrices for in situ oil sands disturbance as well. So just as a summary, we've come a long way, but we recognize there's much more to do. As I've already mentioned, some of the key areas for further work include improvements to national scale peatland mapping, subannual time steps to address winter emissions, the inclusion of soil temperature and permafrost, refinement of methane dynamics, and including additional disturbance types and running climate change scenarios. So as a final thought, I wanted to reflect a bit on the potential for natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions from the perspective of a national managed forest perspective and from the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. And the first point is that the impact on peatlands across all across Canada's managed forests from land use conversions is actually relatively small, although, you know, I want to point out that obviously regionally, these areas might be quite significant. So in terms of total overall area, there's relatively little drainage of peatlands to plant forest or forest harvesting. There's a small amount of peat harvest for horticultural uses. And I guess one of the more uncertain things that there is impacts from forest, from oil and gas operations and road building, but we still have incomplete knowledge and not well quantified impacts of these. The second point really is that the impact on peatlands within Canada's managed forests from the climate change perspective is very large. We know that climate change impacts, particularly from wildfire and permafrost thaw, will be extensive. So, so increase in emissions from peatlands due to climate change will likely be much larger than nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions will be able to increase the sinks. And I don't want to say this to imply that I don't think it's important to implement these sort of natural climate solutions, because we recognize that every ton of carbon matters, every year matters, and every degree matters. But we do have to be very realistic about what we can get from those nature-based solutions and at what cost. And we also need to emphasize that we still have to focus on reducing fossil fuel emissions. So I'm going to finish there, and I'd encourage you to read more about the work that we've done by accessing some of the key papers that I've listed here, or feel free to contact me directly. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cara, for that. And certainly we're really excited to see the Canadian model for Peatlands Camp come online and be tested and used. And it is interesting to definitely hear the conversations at COP. You know, we are seeing nature more well represented at the table, including discussions around nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. We do see, though, that the draft decision only includes reference to forests. So it would be nice to see more recognition of high-value carbon ecosystems like peatlands that are not only important for climate, for water, but also, you know, they're holding irrecoverable carbon. So yeah, let's see how those discussions carry on. Now I'd love to introduce Stephanie Boudreau. She is the science coordinator of the Canadian horticultural peat industry, a position she has held since 2012. With her role, Stephanie develops and maintains partnerships with various peatland stakeholders, including researchers and governments, in supporting the implementation of research programs and restoration projects, and in the development of best practices for the industry. Over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Diana. Just 1 minute, I'm lost in my presentation.
No problem.
Okay,
Great.
here I
That
am.
looks great.
So it's a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon to talk about the perspective from the horticultural peat industry in Canada. So the Canadian Stagnant Peat Moss Association represents 13 horticultural peat moss producers, so more than 80% of the industry, as well as 11 affiliate and associate members. I must mention that although the peat industry is presented as representative of the private sector, it's important to state that, as presented earlier by Maria, we do not represent all the larger private sectors which activities are dependent on access to bog. We represent a small group of companies that extract peat for horticulture. Our role is to promote the responsible management of Canadian peatland, especially when it relates to peat harvesting, to provide leadership in environmental and social stewardship, as well as economic well-being from the wise use of peatlands, to support research related to peatlands and promote science-based best management practices, and to collaborate and communicate with various stakeholders. Before discussing responsible peatland management in more detail, I would like to highlight the significant role of peat in horticulture. To illustrate this, I used this table from a recent study that looked at the economic impact of sectors that rely on peat moss in North America. The inventory of sales at the farm gate of products grown in peat-based growing media is estimated at 23 billion Canadian dollars, which is quite significant. Peat-based growing media supports food production, ornamental horticulture, cannabis production, home gardening, and tree seedlings production. Regarding the footprint of the horticultural peat industry on Canadian peatlands, we are talking about 34,300 hectares that are or have been at some point in the past used for peat harvesting. This represents 0.03% of Canadian peatland. Of this, 61% is currently under production. 26% has been restored, reclaimed, or naturally regenerated. You see the different options at your right, including the moss layer transfer techniques that I will talk more in details in a few minutes, active rewetting that can be used for fen restoration in some specific contexts, reclamation toward forested habitats, also depending on the context, and natural regeneration that includes mostly old block cut sites. 10% of the areas were close to production without intervention. This is what we call the historical footprint, and these areas are targeted for restoration under the National Peatland Restoration Initiative. Finally, 3% has been converted to agricultural landscape. The key successes of our sector include the industry-wide efforts to address common concerns, the unique long-lasting research partnership that we have developed, the focus we have put on ecological restoration, the development of the Veriflora responsibly managed peatland certification, and many other sustainability initiatives that we have done over the past years, including an industry social responsibility report, life cycle analysis, social environmental assessment, etc. All this translates in science-based evidence that helps support policy and regulation development. The item in bold will be addressed a little bit further in the next slide. In terms of research, what is really the success story here is the long-lasting research partnership. It started back in the early 90s with partnership projects with Laval University, and it quickly included many other universities across Canada, as well as many international collaboration. The investment in research are estimated at 20 million Canadian dollars. This has been funded mostly by the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada, which is the federal funding agency for university-based research, combined with private investment around 11 million Canadian dollars. The focus of the research has always been on functions, especially in terms of biodiversity, hydrology, and greenhouse gases. For example, the goal of peatland restoration is the return of ecological functions, including the capacity to accumulate peat and sequester carbon. The research has resulted in the development of restoration techniques for bogs, the moss layer transfer techniques, that can be summarized in 8 steps. The first step is good planning. Then, when ready to restore, the peat surface needs to be refreshed and leveled. You also need to collect plant material at the donor site, which consists in the top centimeters of the peatland plants. Ideally, you would use the vegetation removed when a bog is open for peat harvesting, or you will use vegetation in the designated donor area. Because it's not harvested very deeply, the recovery is usually very good, and a donor site can be used multiple times. Then this material is transported to the site to be restored, and it is spread with regular machinery, in this case a manure spreader, at a ratio of 1:10, which means that 1 meter square of vegetation is spread over 10 meters square. A straw mulch is then spread to protect the plant fragments, and a slight phosphorus fertilization is applied to help plant establishment. Finally, the drainage ditches are blocked to re-wet the site. And we must add that any restoration project should also include a monitoring program to evaluate the success of the restoration and to apply corrective measurements if needed. Here you can see some photos of our restored peatlands, 5 years and 19 years post-restoration. Plant establishment is really quick and includes typical peatland plants diversity. More than 1,800 hectares has been restored with this method, and the research is now looking at adapting it for fen restoration. In terms of greenhouse gas and carbon balance, here you have a figure from a 2018 paper that shows the cumulative net ecosystem exchange of a restored peatland after 14 to 16 years. Positive value are when the site is emitting carbon, while the negative values are when the site is sequestrating carbon. You can see that the site only emits at the beginning of the growing season, and then it becomes a net sink for the rest of the year. The gray area represents the reference ecosystem, the Mer Bleu peatland, actually, that Fereidoun talked earlier, that has been studied for a long period of time. You can see that the sink function of the restored peatland is similar to the one of the natural system, and even at the lowest range of the natural peatland. Now, a few words about the certification. Veriflora certification is known as a gold standard for sustainable horticultural. In 2011, the standard includes an annex on responsibly managed peatland, which became a standalone standard in 2018. The certification includes all aspects of sustainability, including environmental, social, and economic criteria. The requirement takes into account responsible peatland management, ecosystem protection, resource conservation, product quality, fair labor practices, and community engagement. Nowadays, approximately 8% of harvested peatlands in Canada are certified. The National Peatland Restoration Initiative was adopted by the industry in 2016. It includes 3 goals. The first is to reduce by 30% the historical non-restored area in the next 5 years. The second is to target a 100% reduction after 15 years. And finally, to promote ecological restoration of at least 60% of these areas. Within the first 4 years of the initiative, members have reduced by 28% the historical non-restored areas, which means that we are on the right track to meet our first goal. Now, concluding with the key opportunities, I believe it is important to support a Canadian network related to peatland and their responsible management involving all stakeholders. It is also important to continue investing in research in terms of greenhouse gases, but also looking at all the functions of the peatlands. Long-term monitoring is particularly important, and it is one significant outcome of long-lasting partnership. Continued effort with the provinces that support peatland management and with the Indigenous communities across Canada are important. The knowledge transfer and outreach remain essential for the sector to keep and improve our expertise, but also for governmental agencies and other stakeholders. Effort will continue on our side to reduce our historical footprint, but would benefit from governmental support. We believe that better knowledge of the Canadian peatland resource is essential for all. And finally, increased knowledge is needed about the role of peat in food security, food safety, and well-being in order to better balance the impacts of our industry versus the benefits of it. So I thank you for your attention, and do not hesitate to contact me for any question you may have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. I see that some questions are rolling in on the chat that your talk has definitely perked up the ears of the Canadian active composters out there. And so let's hear when we get to the Q&A, some of those responses to the questions. Thanks. I have now Kevin Smith, who is the National Manager Boreal Programs for Ducks Unlimited Canada, Canada's leading wetland conservation organization. Shortly after his undergraduate and graduate training at Cornell and Duke universities in the US, Kevin applied his background in wetland ecology and remote sensing to expand peatland inventories across the boreal forest of Canada, flying around in helicopters, collecting data on this important ecosystem. Through these field campaigns, Kevin developed a deep appreciation for the peatlands of Canada's boreal and has been working with partners to advance solution-oriented collaborative approaches to conserving them ever since. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Diana. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the partnerships that we have to develop some of the nature-based climate solutions across Canada's peatlands. But first, I'm coming from Edmonton, which is within the Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homelands and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. It's also the traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Stoney, Saulteaux, and Blackfoot peoples. And I represent Ducks Unlimited Canada, who's a environmental not-for-profit organization. And we're a national science-based waterfowl conservation organization that's been conserving Canada's wetlands and peatlands since 1938. As we've heard from all of the other panelists and many others at COP26, boreal peatlands are critically important carbon storage and sequestration areas. They're also areas that are changing rapidly due to climate change. And we need solutions that help to mitigate the effects of all of these changes. And today I'll present how peatlands can be key nature-based climate solutions so that we can maintain or increase the below ground carbon stores as a mechanism to address climate change. Given that Canada has some of the largest intact peatland ecosystems on the planet, and that Canada itself has committed to conserving or protecting 25% of the lands by 2025, the first nature-based solution, climate solution that we should adopt with the help of partners is protection. We seek to influence the protection of key peatland areas through the establishment with many partners of Indigenous protected conserved areas, parked, and other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. As one of our panelists, Steve Nita, presented earlier, he played a key role in the creation of Taidene Nene and the lands of his and his people's ancestors as one of Canada's first IPCAs and national parks. As Steve mentioned, we have a great opportunity right now to support Indigenous-led conservation across Canada and across the peatlands of Canada. The next nature-based climate solutions that we work with others on is to better manage the landscape through sustainable land management. Sustainable land management refers to all of the practices and technologies that aim to integrate the management of land, water, and other environmental resources to meet human needs while ensuring long-term sustainability, ecosystem services, biodiversity, and livelihoods. Sustainable land management can happen in a number of key ways. One of the ways that we've worked on with many other partners, and Stephanie just talked a bit about it, is to influence some of the industry certification standards and raise those standards around peatlands and wetlands and other key areas. We also work to establish direct industry conservation partnerships that advance best practices and other pieces working together, coordinating on research, developing inventories of wetlands and peatlands, and many other aspects. The other piece that we do is to work on codes of practice, policies, and regulations that overall effectively maintain peatland function and support that. Some of the examples of the partnerships and projects that we've done is developing guiding principles that support sustainable land use, developing and promoting science-based best management practices, enhancing and elevating principles of peatland stewardship in regulations and policies, providing inventories of carbon storage, and also working with industry and other partners in training and continuing to build the key relationships that we need in order with all land managers in order to effectively manage peatlands, so that all of these partnerships and projects aim to avoid or minimize peatland disturbance, to maintain surface and subsurface water connections, and ultimately to maintain the above and below ground peatland carbon stores, which are so important to mitigate climate change. Another key step towards implementing nature-based climate solutions is the generation, mobilization, sharing, and transfer of knowledge about peatlands. As we heard, a lot of the partners and Ducks Unlimited are partnering on research and gathering a lot of information, closing the knowledge gaps around peatlands across the north. DUC and partners have mapped over 250 million acres of peatlands. It's not quite, as Kara mentioned, not quite coast to coast to coast, but we're getting there and working together and working collaboratively with many organizations so that we have an inventory of peatlands. Because if you don't know where they are or what type of peatland they are, it's very difficult to develop and implement nature-based climate solutions. Conducting and leveraging research is also critical for the development of nature-based climate solutions, as is raising awareness of the importance and role of wetlands in mitigating climate change. We also worked to connect land managers and decision makers with knowledge through portals like the Canadian Conservation and Land Management Knowledge Network that we initiated with several partners, including the Canadian government, to share knowledge about water, wet peatlands, and any other aspects necessary for land management. All of these steps are critical to be able to influence change through sustainable land use practices and policies. And overall, improving understanding of peatlands and connecting all of the practitioners and stakeholders and communities that live within the boreal, providing the tools for peatland protection, management, and restoration supports the implementation more broadly of nature-based climate solutions. And finally, I think the key piece here is a little bit of innovation, that there are a number of emerging nature-based climate solutions in peatlands that if we embrace and continue to work together collaboratively to advance them, we can start to look at how we're going to address climate change more broadly in this important northern boreal region. One of the key aspects that we're currently working on is continuing this knowledge mobilization and sharing. Maria has talked about some of the networks being developed and brought forth to improve understanding, communication, and ultimately conservation of carbon and peatlands across Canada. And like I said earlier, we need to continue to support Indigenous-led conservation, including Indigenous protected and conserved areas across the country. It's one of our best opportunities to make sure that those peatlands remain protected. We can also work on tools like in developing conservation tools in managed landscapes, like other effective area-based conservation measures, and developing those types of tools where protected areas are often harder to finalize. The other key piece that we're working on with others is the development of voluntary carbon offset protocols for things like peatland management, fire management, sustainable forestry, and afforestation. If we don't develop some of these protocols that have the opportunity to influence things like fire policy across the boreal, there's a risk that a lot of the carbon sources or sinks will turn to sources. So we need innovative solutions like that. And we need to also continue to advance the research and applied science of restoration of peatlands where they have already been degraded. Given that Canada's boreal holds nearly 1/4 of the world's carbon, it's a globally significant ecosystem, and as such, we need to continue to develop and implement nature-based climate solutions for this important region. Our partnership-based, science-based, and solutions-oriented approach is to protect, keep everything intact that you possibly can, manage, so employ management and best practices in and around peatlands to ensure that they continue to store and sequester carbon where impacts are not avoidable. And then sharing the knowledge that we have, improving the understanding will allow for the implementation of nature-based climate solutions, and finally innovate, continue to adapt and develop these nature-based climate solutions that we all need. And I'd just like to ask everybody to join Canada and all of the presentation, the previous presenters, we're all partnering together to work towards and advance nature-based climate solutions to help address climate change. And feel free, if you have any further questions, we will have a question and answer period right after this, but please contact me if you'd like to follow up on any of the work that we're doing or discuss any of it. I'm always available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Unfortunately, we didn't seem to see your slides, so I think we'll be coming back to you to get those slides for sharing with everyone afterwards, so that they can also go through it as they watch actually the session back. Now, quite a few questions coming in, and I'm going to come to the panel discussion. Maybe I would like to let's start in order, and I'll ask Maria. Maria, can you comment on the adaptability and resilience of Canada's peatlands in the face of climate change or other anthropogenic disturbances, any human-caused disturbances that are further impacting Canada's peatlands?
Sure, thanks. And Fereidoun might want to jump in after my answer to follow up. But I mean, I think that's a really important question when we think about peatlands in the face of climate change, particularly as it's been highlighted that conservation and protection of our existing peatland carbon stock is really critical for Canada. We also need to understand, what's the fate of that carbon stock going to be moving forward as the climate continues to change. So in the short term, modeling studies have suggested we should still have continued growth of that carbon store, but that does depend a lot on changing disturbance regimes. And I think that's what Kevin was mentioning a bit about, maybe having to think about things like fire management and whether that's going to be needed to protect some of the peatland carbon stock. And it also highlights that we need really aggressive climate action to reduce warming so that we can give the peatlands the best chance they have to keep doing the job that they've been doing for us for thousands of years. When we think about other direct anthropogenic disturbances, the peatlands are severely affected by, if we're draining them or digging up the peat, much less resilient to that. But, that's where we need research on, can we mitigate those? Can we, help them be more resilient? And can we develop effective restoration strategies? I don't know if Fereidoun wants to add anything about sort of winter warming and how that might complicate things. You're still on mute.
Hold on, Fereidoun. And I actually have I'll add another question, which was pushed out for you as well, which is related to that, which is, what have you found, if anything, about the importance of peatlands, the relationship with permafrost, and how permafrost and peatlands interact? And then, of course, I think the cold climate question that Maria passed to you.
Great, yeah, that was muted, sorry. Yeah, I agree with Maria. I mean, with the rapid change that we are seeing for the northern peatlands, and due to this climate warming of the temperature change, I think, yeah, we need more attention also to quantifying how much carbon is added to the atmosphere due to the climate warming. But for the question about the interact of the permafrost and peatland, yeah, as I also mentioned, the large portion of the permafrost in Canada, they are peatland, and it's very important when we, but they have a different hydrological and biogeochemical functioning. You know, they are two different ecosystems. That's why, for example, for the peatland case, we know that, yeah, one of the natural-based solution is clearly like a rebating of the peatland, but this doesn't work for the permafrost because of the soil is frozen, and then they have a different functioning in their system. Yeah, for sure. I mean, when we talk about the nature-based solution or also nature-climate solution, those are the two things that we are hoping to apply and as action that we can use it to mitigate the CO2 emission in future for both the case of the peatland and also the permafrost in future. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I'm going to jump to Stephanie. Stephanie, one of the participants asked, considering the growing composting, I guess composting in Canada, and seeing how many countries are working on banning the use of peat in horticulture, like England, and also I think Peru has already just done it this year. Why isn't the industry investing in moving toward composting?
Well, composting cannot replace it all in terms of quantity that is required by the horticultural industry in general for food production. So quality and the consistency, I should say, maybe that's the quality of peat. It's available, it's consistent, and it has the quality needed for horticultural, especially as a basic component of a growing media. Also, any alternative, all the companies are doing their own research on alternatives. It is something done more at the company level than at the association level. But any alternative has impact as well. There's no one that has no impact. So compost has many benefits, but may also have some impact, for example, on water quality with the leachate. So I believe that there is not one product that fits our needs. So it's a matter of wise use, responsible management, and thinking growing media industry in an eco-friendly way or a wise way.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephanie. I have a question. I guess I'll throw it to Cara. How has the research community contributed to peatlands management in Canada over the past decades, and how can their contribution be improved or optimized?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I guess one of the benefits of being in Canada, and I think you see it from just the panel of people that you have here today, and I would say that most of the people I've interacted with on this panel through some sort of professional collaboration in some degree. So I think that we have a really good system in which federal government and actually provincial governments aren't necessarily represented on this panel, but the federal, provincial, the universities, the industry, First Nations, we actually have a fairly good track record of working together on an assortment of projects, whether it be focused specifically on peatlands management. And I think there's examples from peat harvesting or harvesting trees on peaty soils to oil sands development, where we all have different strengths that we bring to our research that we can contribute to different projects. So a lot of times it's been more on a project by project basis, but I think most of these that have involved sort of peatland management often include people from all of these different sectors. And so I think actually that's one of the great things about sort of our peatland research community in Canada. And I think this new initiative with CanPeat is also moving exactly towards to some of those goals. So how can we improve that or optimize it into the future? I think, you know, opportunities like this to share ideas and to network and to make people aware of what our own, you know, what we're doing in our own little silos we're doing and how we can sort of make those connections across silos can always be improved. But I think we're actually doing a pretty good job so far. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks so much. I suppose Steve has just stepped away, so I'll stack all his questions together. Oh, Stephen, there you are. So I was also just wondering a little bit. One of the questions is, can you share a little bit more about Indigenous people's ways of knowing and sharing, and how is this coming into the science community? Or you gave a little example of how, you know, through the Indigenous Circle of Experts contributing to legislation and new, you know, looking at new ways of approaching conservation. But can you just give a little bit more for those out there around the world that don't really truly understand, you know, the sense of what Indigenous people's way of knowing and sharing your knowledge is?
It seems like a simple question, but it is quite complicated. I think it's proven quite succinctly now by scientists that lands that are managed or owned or influenced by Indigenous people are the healthiest lands in the world. 80% of the remaining biodiversity are on those lands. 80%, there's only 25% or so biodiversity left on Earth. There's got to be a reason why that is. It is the worldview that we are not above nature. We are part of nature, and that we need nature to survive. We manage ourselves and our relationship with nature with the goal of creating abundance, not just good enough. And you see globally, Indigenous people are the ones that are getting killed, jailed, harassed for protecting the nature that's left. And they're putting their lives on the line. Here in Canada, no difference. With every pipeline, every project that's been developed, there's always been opposition from Indigenous people. They know that their relationship and our collective relationship with land is essential. And I think that's what's driving the current energy around the creation of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Working with scientists, working with academia to combine the two knowledge systems. You know, we've created what we call through the Indigenous Circle of Experts and the report, an elder named Dr. Reg Croshu from the Piikani Nation in southern Alberta created what he called an ethical space, where two knowledge systems can come together without worrying about violence being done against each other, where respect is the key to accepting the other knowledge systems if we can, and respecting it if we can. Another elder, Albert Marshall from the Mi'kmaq Nation in Eastern Canada, came up with the term two-eyed seeing. And it's taking the best of Western science and the best of Indigenous knowledge systems and combining the two in essence, pretty much start creating new knowledge systems and applying that system in our day-to-day lives and the management and management of ecosystems. I would argue that we don't have an environmental problem. What we have is a socioeconomic problem. People's decisions and their relationship with nature is a social issue. It's not an environmental issue. And I think the worldview that Indigenous peoples have in their relationship with nature and their complete understanding and acceptance that nature is a life giver is something that should be part of the education system. It's unfortunate that colonialism killed the potential of combining Indigenous knowledge systems and worldviews, and combining that with Western science was snubbed out through colonial policies. Now we have an opportunity. Indigenous people are, after all the heartaches and suffering that those policies have resulted in, they're standing out here. They're extending an olive branch. They're willing to work with the Crown governments, in Canada's case, scientists, academia, to bring more knowledge and more knowledge that's aligned with a worldview and an understanding that we can't live without nature, and that we are not above nature, that we are part of nature. Now, I think that's the long and short answer of that. And to answer some of the questions, what's changed? What's changing in my part of the country based on climate change? Well, it's -5, -8 outside. Normally it's -20 to -30. The lake should be smoking now, smoke on water. It's not. The heat is still retained in the Great Slave Lake. The rivers are not freezing. We're also seeing the drying out of small lakes that form above the permafrost. It's going. The high water mark in the last couple of years is extreme. That tells us that the watersheds, the head of the watersheds are melting. The mountain ice caps are melting. So we're seeing extremely high water levels on all the tributaries on both sides of the Rocky Mountains. That's beginning of a big change. The challenge here when it comes to the potential for great things to happen in collaboration and partnership between Indigenous governments and public governments in Canada, especially around the peatlands. As you see by the maps, the peatlands and carbon sinks are in the northern part of the country. Those are irrecoverable carbon sinks. But the biggest market that can help with the cost of managing those areas that doesn't qualify because it's issues of additionality. The threat of climate change is not recognized as part of for qualification of additionality. So the cost of managing lands right around the world is extremely high. And Canada sits on 30 to 40% of the carbon sink through the peatlands that we have in the boreal forest and other carbon sinks. 3% of the world's around the peatland is 3% of the world's landmass. The world cannot expect Canada to pay for all of that, and the world should. There's got to be mechanisms where the cost of sharing the awesome responsibility of these spaces that are globally significant and impactful if it goes awry. Processes need to be created to support the management of these places. And as I'm saying, Indigenous people, these are the homelands of Indigenous peoples. Peatlands, wetlands are so important to Indigenous ways of life and food security. That's where the wetlands are where the animals are that we harvest. That's where the medicines are. That's where the plants are. The cleaning system that they provide in making sure that the rivers and lakes are clean for good, healthy fish. It's all connected. But I'm afraid that, you know, as I see the water rising on the rivers, the major rivers and the major lakes, maybe we're starting to see a draining of this, natural draining of these peatlands. So I think that's some of the questions in science that we need to ask. Is it all coming from the headwaters, the source from the headwaters? Some of the questions I have. Hopefully that answers their questions.
Yes, thanks so much. I mean, obviously, it's really, you know, I'd love to be able to talk to you all night about that subject. It's really just so important to me personally. For me, I think that what's really interesting at the climate discussions now is that nature is being enveloped in there. And you might have missed it. Last week, we had two world-renowned economists launch a paper on the undervaluation and the underinvestment in peatlands. And there's some new innovative ways to look through a lens at actually paying and valuing and investing in peatlands as they are intact, and doing the remarkable job that they do for all of us. So similar questions that are popping up for the Congo Basin peatlands, where yes, indeed, they can't get results of based payments because there's no emissions from their pristine, fabulous peatlands. But this is something that the Global Peatlands Initiative partners are working really hard to figure out what sort of finance for nature, what does that mean? Also debt for nature swaps, other biodiversity offsetting mechanisms. And at least European banks, private banks, are leading in the way investing in nature. So we can definitely bring some of those lessons to yourselves. Before we go, I want to give one more question to Kevin, because we didn't hear from you, Kevin, and then a final close from Maria, maybe on the Can Peat project, because I know a lot of people are interested in that. But first of all, Kevin, one person online asks, my local municipality is converting an inactive agricultural field to a constructed wetland, and Ducks Unlimited was involved in the wetland design. Is the design of constructed wetlands a common role of Ducks Unlimited in Canada? And are they pursuing opportunities to construct wetlands as nature-based climate solutions? Kevin, over to you, and then Maria, I'll ask you on the Can Peat. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. Yes, we do. Ducks Unlimited is involved in multiple wetland construction projects and restoration projects across the country, across Canada, through the US, and even Mexico. So we do a lot of work on the restoration side. We're still figuring out some of the details. Several of the research groups that we work with are trying to figure out, you know, how do you restore things like swamps, and you know, we've had a lot of good progress on how to restore bogs and fens. But yeah, we do a lot of work on the wetland restoration side. Absolutely.
Thanks so much. And there were some other questions that we didn't get to. There are actually quite a lot of activity. So I will take them, note them down, and we'll get back to them on the online platform. But before we close, thank you so much. I want to hand it off to Maria to give us some more details about Can Peat. How can you highlight the project? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much. Like I said, we're waiting to find out the final results of the funding decision. We should hope by the end of the year we'll have some good news to share with everyone. But like I said, I mean, the goal is really collaboration and capitalizing on the knowledge we have in Canada, but maybe is still a bit disparate. So, you know, one of the goals that we think it will be valuable to the whole international peatland community is we're really going to try to bring that information together in one place. This would be, you know, the focus is really on climate. So there'll be a lot of information on carbon and greenhouse gas exchange and making that into an open access database that will support modeling efforts in Canada, but we think also worldwide. but then really working with partners to also try to develop tools and management strategies that can actually be implemented on the ground, working with economists on some of those questions that you asked, Diana, but also with Indigenous partners to, also include conservation in that way, but addressing like what are the best mechanisms that we can have to protect and restore peatlands in Canada, and using some of that data compilation to support those questions and that understanding. In terms of, I know we're just about out of time, but I think there's a lot of exciting peatland initiatives going on around the world, building national collaborations and regional collaborations. So we hope to learn from those and to share the learnings as well with those. And, regardless of the funding decision, I think this has solidified the peatland community in Canada, and we see, hosting many peatland workshops and knowledge exchanges moving forward.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much to all the speakers. It's really been a pleasure indeed, Stephen, to share the space with everyone and yourself. I wanted to also thank the University of Waterloo, Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change, and the Water Institute for co-hosting this event. And also for you participants in the Peatlands Pavilion staying late, or you in your home or at your office joining in. I really just want to reflect on the importance of national assessments as a vehicle to achieving the optimal use of peatlands as a nature-based solution in the international context. Let's not stop saying that peatlands matter. And I just want to congratulate you, the Canadian experts and organizations and advocates, and the growing and strengthening network on your outstanding work. We are so excited to plug that into the Global Peatlands Initiative, to share peer-to-peer exchanges and really to advance the conservation, protection, and sustainable management of peatlands globally. Thank you so much, and have a great over there, Canada, and I'm going to have a good evening.
Okay, thank you.